And I was like, my. What links we will go to as companies out there to continue to deliver the message. That's right. Continue to deliver the agenda. And nobody fits that agenda better than Paige Bueckers. My goodness. She checks all kinds of boxes, including the Yukon Mafia box. Oh, yeah. You're in. Want to know? There's all kinds of reasons in one video why they...
The headline sounded explosive, unprecedented off-court impact, big words, bold claim. But when you slow down and actually look at the numbers, something doesn't add up, and that's where this story really begins. Because this isn't a debate about talent, it's not a knock on Paige Bueckers as a basketball player. It's a question about narrative versus reality.
I mean, Lego may as well just taken that money and just lit it on fire. Just lighted a flame. Because Paige Bueckers not drawing.
And whether the WNBA is trying to sell fans a story that the data simply doesn't support. We've been told repeatedly that Bueckers is driving historic, game-changing momentum for the league, that her off-court influence is unmatched, that brands lining up behind her prove she's the face of the future. But here, the problem, when you compare attendance, viewership, and national buzz, the gap between messaging and measurable impact becomes impossible to ignore. At the same time, Caitlin Clark is doing something the league hasn't seen in decades, selling out arenas, forcing games into NBA venues, pulling massive TV audiences, landing marketing campaigns that reach tens of millions of people without needing to be declared unprecedented by anyone. And that contrast has sparked a backlash. Fans aren't confused, they're skeptical. They're asking why one player is being elevated through press releases and partnerships, while another is clearly moving the needle in real time. They're questioning whether this is about organic popularity or about a league trying to control who represents it. Because when headlines say one thing, but seats, ratings, and revenue say another, people start looking deeper. And once you do, the story gets a lot more uncomfortable. To understand why this debate even exists, you have to look at how leagues traditionally build stars. It rarely starts with fans. It starts in boardrooms, media strategy meetings, sponsorship decks. Long before the season tips off, decisions are already being made about who will be positioned as the face of the product. That's not unique to basketball. Every major league does it. The WNBA has always leaned heavily on familiar pipelines, college programs with national recognition, players who already fit cleanly into existing media frameworks, athletes who are easy to package, easy to explain, and easy to promote to sponsors who want clarity, not risk. From that perspective, the league's early push makes sense. It's controlled, predictable, safe. The issue is what happens when the audience doesn't follow the script. Instead of rallying behind the league-selected narrative, fans gravitated somewhere else. Not because they were told to, because they felt it. They showed up in person. They tuned in on national broadcasts. They shared clips organically. And they did it without needing press releases to tell them who mattered. That's where the disconnect started. While league messaging focused on branding, partnerships, and impact, the audience focused on experiences, which games felt electric, which matchups felt like events, which players made the league feel bigger than it was before. Those two perspectives didn't just diverge, they moved in opposite directions. And when that happens, no amount of marketing language can fully bridge the gap. What made this situation combustible wasn't promotion itself. It was the insistence that promotion and popularity were the same thing. Fans weren't rejecting one player in favor of another out of spite. They were reacting to what they could see, measure, and feel in real time. Attendance, ratings, energy. Once fans started noticing that the league's loudest claims didn't align with its strongest metrics, skepticism was inevitable. And skepticism spreads fast in the modern sports landscape. Social media doesn't wait for official explanations. It fills the gaps immediately. That's when conversations shifted from basketball to credibility. Because fans don't mind being marketed to, what they mind is being told something is unprecedented while witnessing a very different reality with their own eyes. And once that trust cracks, every headline gets questioned. Which leads directly to the comparison the league may not have wanted, but created anyway. Because when one player is labeled historic, people naturally look at who's actually drawing the crowds. And that's where the numbers begin to speak for themselves. This is where the conversation stops being about opinions and starts being about evidence. Because once fans began lining up the numbers side by side, the contrast became hard to explain away. Across multiple markets, games featuring Caitlin Clark didn't just perform well, they overperformed. Attendance surged to levels the league rarely sees. Venues were upgraded, tickets sold faster, broadcast windows expanded. These weren't projections or internal estimates. These were visible, measurable outcomes that anyone could track in real time. Meanwhile, games without Clark told a different story. That doesn't mean other players lacked talent or value, but it does mean the term unprecedented started raising eyebrows. Because unprecedented impact, by definition, should show up in the places that matter most to a league trying to grow: seats filled, screens tuned in, conversations happening outside core fan circles. And that's where the disconnect widened. When certain games struggled to break past modest attendance while others exploded into national events, fans naturally began asking why the league's messaging didn't reflect that difference. Why was the spotlight evenly distributed when the response clearly was? This isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about acknowledging that not all attention is equal. A packed arena isn't symbolic, it's commitment. A spike in viewership isn't theoretical, it's proof of interest. And when one player repeatedly drives both, it becomes impossible to frame her influence as just another part of a balanced ecosystem. What made this situation even more volatile was how the data was explained afterward. Instead of openly acknowledging where demand was coming from, messaging often shifted toward broad themes: overall growth, regional strength, long-term momentum. Those phrases aren't wrong, but they can feel evasive when fans are staring at stark contrasts. That's when trust starts to erode. Because fans aren't rejecting growth, they're rejecting selective framing. They want honesty about what's working and why, and when they don't get it, speculation fills the void. Some began to wonder if the league was hesitant to center its marketing around one breakout star. Others suggested leadership preferred a more controlled image of parity. None of that is proven, but the fact those questions gained traction says a lot. The numbers didn't create controversy. The gap between numbers and narrative did. And once that gap became visible, it forced a harder question, one the league couldn't dodge forever. If one player is clearly driving national attention, why does the messaging keep trying to spread it evenly? Because the answer to that question changes how fans see everything else that comes next. At this point, the issue wasn't just performance, it was positioning. The WNBA found itself caught between two very different forces: the story it wanted to tell and the behavior fans were clearly showing. From a branding standpoint, the league's approach is understandable: balanced visibility, multiple marketable faces, a narrative that suggests depth rather than dependence on one star. In theory, that protects long-term stability. In practice, it can collide head-on with reality when demand concentrates around a single player. That's exactly what happened. As Caitlin Clark continued driving sellouts, viewership spikes, and mainstream attention, the league didn't fully pivot. Instead, it doubled down on a broader messaging strategy, highlighting partnerships, profiles, and off-court impact around other players, including Paige Bueckers. And that's where fans started pushing back. Not because they dislike Bueckers, not because they deny her talent, but because the framing felt disconnected from what they were seeing play out week after week. When demand is lopsided, pretending it's evenly distributed can feel like spin, even if the intention is growth. This is a critical mistake leagues make in the modern media era. Fans now have access to the same data as executives: attendance numbers, TV ratings, social engagement. You can't quietly manage perception anymore. If the story doesn't line up with observable reality, credibility takes a hit. That's why the term manufactured narrative started appearing in conversations, not as a definitive accusation, but as a reaction. Fans felt like branding was being prioritized over transparency, that certain players were being elevated because they fit a cleaner, safer image, while the most disruptive, attention-grabbing star was treated as just one piece of a larger puzzle. But disruption is exactly what growth looks like. Every major sports leap has come from imbalance. Jordan, Tiger, Serena, they didn't fit neatly into shared spotlight strategies. They forced leagues to reorganize around them. Trying to smooth out that spike doesn't make it go away, it just frustrates the audience noticing it. This is where the WNBA lost control of the conversation. Because once fans believe branding is being used to override demand, every sponsorship announcement and headline becomes suspect. Even legitimate partnerships get questioned. Even genuine praise gets reframed. And that skepticism doesn't disappear easily. Instead, it sets the stage for the most damaging outcome of all, not backlash against players, but doubt about the league's honesty. And once that doubt takes hold, rebuilding trust becomes harder than selling tickets ever was. Here where the conversation took a sharper turn and where it's important to be precise. The frustration that started bubbling up wasn't really aimed at Paige Bueckers as an individual. Most fans respect her game. Many admire her resume. The tension came from something else entirely: intent. Once the gap between demand and promotion became obvious, fans began asking why the league seemed so committed to certain narratives, not as a conspiracy, but as a strategy question. What factors actually determine who gets pushed hardest? Is it purely numbers? Is it market balance? Is it brand safety? Is it long-term planning? Those questions matter because they shape trust. Some fans speculated that the league preferred a more controlled rollout of star power, one that emphasized balance, shared spotlight, and institutional continuity rather than allowing one breakout figure to dominate the conversation. Others argued that leadership may be wary of becoming too dependent on a single player, regardless of how much attention she generates. None of that is proven fact, but the perception itself became influential. And perception spreads fast when communication isn't clear. What made this especially volatile was how criticism was often framed. Instead of directly addressing why certain metrics were being emphasized over others, league messaging tended to lean on broad language, values, representation, long-term growth, cultural impact. Those are valid goals, but when they're not paired with transparency about what's actually driving fans to show up, they can feel deflective. That's when debates escalated. Some fans began interpreting selective promotion as ideological. Others saw it as corporate risk management. Still others viewed it as simple miscalculation. The point isn't which interpretation is correct. The point is that ambiguity allowed all of them to flourish. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark continued doing the one thing that cuts through every narrative, drawing people in. Big crowds, national buzz, measurable spikes, no messaging required. That contrast is what intensified scrutiny. When one player's impact is visible without explanation, and another's impact requires explanation, fans naturally compare the two. And when comparisons aren't acknowledged honestly, skepticism grows. This is the danger zone for any league. Not because disagreement exists, but because fans stop believing the league is speaking plainly. And once that belief fades, even good faith efforts get interpreted through a lens of doubt. At that point, the issue is no longer about which player deserves praise. It's about whether the league trusts its audience enough to tell the full story. And that question doesn't go away quietly. This is where the debate often gets simplified and where it usually goes wrong. Sponsorship announcements get treated like receipts, as if a brand deal automatically equals mass appeal. But in reality, sponsorships prove alignment, not demand. And confusing the two is what poured fuel on this entire controversy. When brands partner with Paige Bueckers, that doesn't mean fans are suddenly lining up nationwide because of her. It means companies see a clean image, a strong resume, and a story they're comfortable attaching to. That's branding. It's cautious, it's calculated, and it doesn't always track with who's actually driving attention week to week. That's why fans started pushing back on the idea that sponsorships alone proved unprecedented impact. Because at the same time, Caitlin Clark was delivering something different: organic reach. Not announced, not framed, just happening. Campaigns tied to Clark didn't need to be explained or defended. They spread because people were already watching, sharing, and talking. That difference matters. Brands often follow leagues, but sometimes brands follow audiences, and fans noticed which direction the traffic was flowing. When sponsorship headlines were used to justify league-wide claims of dominance, while attendance and ratings told a more uneven story, skepticism was inevitable. This doesn't mean partnerships are meaningless. They're valuable signals, but they're not the same as sellouts, venue upgrades, or sustained national viewership. Those are harder to manufacture, and fans can feel the difference. The optics didn't help either. When marketing leaned heavily on polished visuals and buzzwords, while live arenas told a quieter story, it created whiplash. The message said momentum. The environment felt selective, and that's when people stopped arguing about players and started arguing about credibility. That's the danger zone for any league. Because fans don't reject marketing, they reject being told what they're seeing isn't happening. When sponsorships are presented as the ultimate proof point, without context, fans respond by pulling out the metrics that matter to them. Seats filled, screens tuned, conversations happening without prompting. Once that happens, the debate shifts again. It's no longer about whether a player deserves opportunities or partnerships. It becomes a question of whether the league is letting audience behavior inform strategy or trying to reverse engineer it after the fact. And that's a much harder problem to solve. Because you can sign deals, you can craft campaigns, but you can't force people to care. And that's the lesson the WNBA now has to confront head-on. Every league says it wants stars, but what they really want is predictable stars, the kind that fit cleanly into long-term plans, balanced marketing decks, and carefully managed narratives. The problem for the WNBA is that Caitlin Clark didn't arrive politely or quietly. She arrived loud, disruptive, and impossible to ignore. That's where the tension truly sits. Clark's rise wasn't scheduled, it wasn't curated, it wasn't rolled out in phases. It happened because fans decided it should happen. They showed up, they tuned in, they talked about her whether the league centered her or not. And once that kind of organic momentum exists, it's almost impossible to steer without looking like you're resisting it. This is where institutional control becomes visible. Leagues prefer equilibrium, shared spotlight, multiple faces carrying equal weight. It reduces risk, it prevents over-reliance, and in theory, it protects the product if one star gets hurt, struggles, or leaves. But equilibrium only works when demand is naturally spread. When it's not, forcing balance can feel artificial. That's exactly how fans interpreted what they were seeing. Instead of leaning fully into the wave Clark created, the league appeared to slow it down, intentionally or not, by emphasizing other storylines just as loudly. That choice may have been strategic, but perception doesn't care about intent. Fans don't experience strategy, they experience results. And the result felt like friction. Meanwhile, Paige Bueckers became unintentionally caught in the middle, not as a villain, not as a rival, but as a symbol of institutional preference. That's an unfair position for any player to be in, yet it happens all the time in sports when leagues choose presentation over reaction. The key issue isn't favoritism, it's timing. When a league tries to guide attention after fans have already chosen where to focus, it creates resistance, not because fans hate the alternatives, but because they resent being redirected. Organic stardom feels earned, managed stardom feels assigned. And once fans label something as assigned, trust erodes fast. This is the crossroads the WNBA now stands at. It can continue trying to smooth out demand into something evenly distributed, or it can accept that moments like Clark's don't come often and can't be shaped without losing authenticity. Because history is clear on one thing: the biggest stars don't fit systems. The systems eventually bend around them. And the longer that bending is delayed, the louder the backlash becomes. That's not a player problem. That's a structural one. At this stage, the debate has grown beyond any single player. It's no longer about comparing resumes or arguing who deserves what. It's about what happens when a league reaches a turning point and has to decide how much control it's willing to give up in favor of authenticity. The WNBA is in that moment right now. On one side, there's the traditional approach: carefully curated stars, evenly distributed promotion, and messaging designed to reinforce stability. On the other, there's a reality shaped by fan behavior, where attention isn't spread evenly and momentum doesn't ask for permission. The friction between those two forces is what fans are reacting to, not the players themselves. This is where trust becomes the most valuable currency. Fans don't expect perfection. They don't expect every decision to favor their preferred player. What they expect is honesty. When messaging aligns with what they see, packed arenas, elevated broadcasts, genuine buzz, trust grows. When it doesn't, skepticism fills the gap. And skepticism doesn't stay quiet. The risk for the league isn't criticism, it's disengagement. Fans who feel talked at instead of spoken with don't always argue forever. Eventually, they tune out. And for a league still fighting for sustained national attention, that's the worst possible outcome. There's also an opportunity hidden inside this tension. Moments like this can force clarity. They can push leadership to reassess what growth really looks like. Not controlled expansion, not curated parity, but leaning into what fans are already telling you clearly and consistently through their choices. That doesn't mean abandoning long-term planning or elevating one player at the expense of others. It means acknowledging that organic stars don't threaten a league. They strengthen it. They pull in new audiences. They expand reach beyond traditional boundaries. They create entry points for people who might never have cared otherwise. If the league adapts, this becomes a case study in evolution. A moment where leadership listened, adjusted, and let authenticity drive strategy. If it doesn't, the divide between messaging and reality only grows wider. And that divide is what turns debate into disillusionment. The next steps matter more than any headline or partnership announcement, because how the league responds now will shape how fans interpret everything that comes next. Not just who gets promoted, but whether the league itself feels credible. And once credibility is questioned, rebuilding it is far harder than growing it in the first place. Write next section and make it around 350 words. When you strip away the noise, this entire debate comes down to one unavoidable truth. Fans decide relevance, not headlines, not press releases, not brand decks, and definitely not carefully worded claims about unprecedented impact. What's happening right now inside the WNBA isn't a feud between players. It's a clash between organic demand and institutional messaging, and history shows us how that story usually ends. Leagues can guide attention, but they can't override it forever. Caitlin Clark didn't become the center of this conversation because she was declared the face of anything. She became unavoidable because fans showed up in record numbers, tuned in nationally, and turned her games into events. That kind of momentum isn't assigned. It's earned in real time. At the same time, Paige Bueckers didn't create this controversy either. She became part of it because promotion without matching demand invites scrutiny, and when scrutiny grows, it doesn't stay polite. It turns into skepticism about motives, priorities, and honesty. That's the real risk here. Not backlash, not criticism, but erosion of trust. Fans don't expect leagues to get everything right. They expect them to be real, to acknowledge what's actually working, to let numbers speak without spinning them into something they're not. When leagues try to smooth out reality instead of embracing it, fans notice and they push back. The irony is that this moment could be the WNBA's biggest opportunity. Authentic stars don't limit growth, they accelerate it. They bring in new audiences, new conversations, and new energy that can lift everyone around them. But only if the league lets that energy flow instead of trying to redirect it. Because you can sign sponsorships. You can craft narratives. You can promote balance. But you can't force belief. That comes from packed arenas, rising ratings, and people caring enough to argue in the first place. And right now, the message from fans is clear. The numbers are already talking. The only question left is whether the league is willing to listen.